Welcome, everyone, to the October 23rd edition of Wednesday with Walton and Newberry, brought to you here in video form at thecardinalnation.com, as well as audio at the Scoop Sports Network and all your favorite podcast apps. Welcome, Blake.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be here.
So we got a lot to talk about. A number of announcements were made by the Cardinals on Tuesday. Of course, it's kind of the break here between the Championship Series and the World Series. And the Cardinals are also highly motivated to get personnel announcements done, as everybody across the game is trying to get their chairs aligned to where they want to be next year. The first announcement, and probably the most major announcement, is that the Cardinals announced a new assistant general manager, and who is going to be in charge of both baseball operations, player development, and performance. So he's AGM of player development performance. And this gentleman is 32-year-old Rob Cerfolio, who came from the Cleveland Indians organization. And his most recent job there was director of player development. And just a quick terminology point, director of player development is basically the farm director. And so Rob Cerfolio is getting a promotion from basically the farm director to being the executive over both the farm director of player development, and director of performance. And director of performance is a part of the organization that was run previously by Dr. Robert Butler, who's left the organization. And they're about trying to get the maximum performance out of the individual players. And in a Zoom call on Tuesday afternoon, John Mozeliak said that he really wants to get those two parts of the organization working together better, seamlessly, rather than as individual towers. Now, Cerfolio, age 32, very young guy, but the Cleveland organization, the Cleveland Guardians, have a pretty good reputation for both player development and getting a lot for their money. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think you just hit it right on the head there, especially at the end. The Guardians are probably a top three organization in baseball in terms of player development. There's a reason they're consistently competitive with basically a shoestring budget by today's standards. And I think that speaks volumes about the work they're able to do in the player development department, and especially on the pitching side, where they consistently churn out guys who pitch not only in the bottom of a rotation, but also towards the middle and the top of a rotation. And that's been huge for them, and it's allowed them to consistently punch above their weight. So hopefully Cerfolio can kind of bring some of the things they've done really well over there and bring them into St. Louis. But I think it also is really interesting to note the contrast that is made from this hire, because Cerfolio is obviously 32. Gary LaRocque was 71. I know, not exactly apples to apples, not exactly the same position, because Cerfolio will be above the head of, or I guess he is the head of play development, but he'll be above the farm director. And I think LaRocque was not necessarily somebody who was super analytically inclined. And I think Cerfolio, being a 32-year-old grad coming from the Guardian system who graduated from Yale, is definitely going to be a step in a completely different direction. And I think that's a step the Cardinals wanted to take. So personally, I'm excited about the move. I think Cerfolio is something of an up-and-comer in baseball as a whole. Comes from a good organization. He's started out as an intern and basically worked his way to where he's at now pretty quickly. So all of those things are good signs.
And very curious today, the announcement, what the quote in the announcement from the team was from John Mozeliak. Chaim Bloom's name wasn't mentioned. In the press conference this afternoon, again, Chaim Bloom's name wasn't mentioned. I think it's clear that Cerfolio has got Bloom's fingerprints all over him. But it's interesting, in his last year as president of baseball ops, John Mozeliak is still making clear, even in the area of the farm system, that he's the man in charge. But what'll happen certainly next year, Bloom will be the president of baseball ops. There'll be a new GM. Mozeliak has said he's basically going to be the GM this year. Then Cerfolio, who's an assistant general manager, and reporting to Cerfolio will be the farm director and this director of performance. Just one other point, to the point you made about Gary LaRocque. Gary LaRocque started as the farm director of player development. Then later he was given the AGM title. So basically what's happening is they're splitting what LaRocque's job was into two pieces, with Cerfolio as the AGM and then this farm director of player development under him. What Mozeliak said is that they wanted to have the new AGM, Cerfolio, be directly involved in making those two hires, those two director hires. And so he's going to get started on that immediately. It doesn't seem like they're close to making those announcements, but again, they need to get on that pretty quickly. So I would hope that after the GM meeting Certainly, second week in November, so we should be seeing something there, I hope.
Yeah, I would think so. And it's encouraging that the Cardinals have struck as quickly as they have, both in bringing in Cerfolio and then in bringing in a hitting coach and not like just sitting on this and letting it, fester into the winter meetings or even longer. So hopefully Cerfolio gets in. Maybe he already has a few names in mind that he'd like to interview and the Cardinals can get cracking on that.
All right, so since you mentioned the coaching changes, let's talk about that. Very popular move, I think. Jon Jay, ex-Cardinal, definitely fits the Cardinals mold as a hire. While the announcement said his generic title is coach, he's going to be outfield coach and other duties as assigned. And that was the job responsibilities previously of Willie McGee. Again, 66-year-old versus 39-year-old. I asked Mozeliak if there was an initiative, not just in these hires, but in other hires, to get the coaching staff younger, and he really didn't take the bait on that one. But there's no doubt that Willie McGee is more toward the end of his coaching career, and Jon Jay is more getting started. He was very well thought of in his time and with the Miami Marlins. Is very good friends with Daniel Descalso, who folks probably know as the Cardinals bench coach. And I think the bringing in Jon Jay will be a good thing. Maybe he can figure out and help Jordan Walker. He can help Victor Scott. Some of the young outfielders who need some help with their defense. What's your take on the Jon Jay, Willie McGee moves?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Jon Jay coming in, and I know you mentioned Willie McGee was in charge of the outfielders, but do you know if his official title was outfield coach or not? Because I believe in Katie Woo's article a couple weeks ago, she mentioned the Cardinals didn't have a full-time outfield coach, and
Well,
that felt
again,
weird to me. That felt weird to me.
the title is just coach, but again, we asked Mozeliak specifically, one of the writers I didn't asked specifically, is Jon Jay in charge of the outfielders? And he said yes. And I believe McGee was. Whether
Okay.
that was full time or not, I don't know. But he was as close to the out as an outfield coach as they had.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, I think, at the very least, it helps to have a full-time designated outfield coach, whether they already had one or not. And I think to your point, what you mentioned earlier, Jordan Walker and Victor Scott are huge pieces that the Cardinals really need to develop. And I think when you look at kind of the potential for the next great Cardinals team, Jordan Walker and Victor Scott both have the chance to be on there. And they both are guys who can frankly be a lot better defensively than they have been. Victor Scott obviously has all the speed and tools that you would want out of an elite center fielder. He just doesn't make the best reads all the time. And Jordan Walker is exceptionally fast for somebody his size, but he too struggles with reads. So it'll be really interesting to see if Jon Jay can really get the best out of these guys and really get them progressing in a positive direction defensively.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. So the other new coach is Brant Brown. And Brown, interestingly enough, has a long history with the Dodgers, other organizations as he was growing up. He was hitting coach with Skip Schumacher's 2023 Florida Marlins. That team, of course, made the playoffs, but their offense was far below average. That offense was 26th in MLB in runs scored. And then Brown received a promotion for 2024, moved to the Seattle Mariners. And he had this assignment, kind of a hybrid position where he was bench coach, but he also was focused on the mental side and the adjustments of hitting during the games, not necessarily the mechanics and the swings. Well, that only lasted 2 months, and Brant Brown was fired from the Mariners, so he was looking for a new job, and he is now the new hitting coach of the St. Louis Cardinals. Uh, Comments?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting hire. Obviously, I'm not going to pretend like I know anything about any of the heading coach candidates that were out there. But having done just a little bit of poking around on the Cardinals' new hitting coach, like it feels like something I'm cautiously optimistic about. Like the stuff about pregame approach and in-game adjustments. Like I think a lot of people would agree that there's room for growth there on the Cardinals. Now, obviously, his track record with the Mariners isn't as strong, but also Skip Schumacher gave him, his highest regards as a hitting coach. So, it's hit or miss depending on what you want to look at there. And I believe when I was looking over kind of, his hiring and his firing in past organizations, he got some knocks when he was fired for, his pregame meetings becoming too complex for some players. So it'll be interesting to see if he can maybe tailor his message a little bit better to hitters. And I think that's something that maybe the Cardinals feel decent about because Mozeliak mentioned him being a change from where they've been and in between somebody like Jeff Albert and somebody like Turner Ward in terms of approach. And it feels like confidence is pretty high that he's the right guy, obviously, since he was hired and from those quotes. So hopefully he can make a difference because I think the Cardinals' offense was probably the most disappointing part of the team this year, at least at the major league level.
Yes, and I want to come back to a comment you made just a few seconds ago, and that is Mozeliak's comment that his approach will be somewhere between Jeff Albert and Turner Ward, the last two hitting coaches. And while it was not said, the implication was that perhaps Albert was too far toward the analytical end of the scale, and Turner Ward might have been too far toward the traditional hitting coach end of the scale, and they're trying to find a better mix. At least that was my interpretation from it. The other thing I asked Mozeliak about was, is Brown going to have any impact on the minor league system on player development? Because there's a lot of moving parts, right? Player development is making some major changes as well. And he said, no, Brown is really going to focus on the major leagues, that they're very happy with Russ Steinhorn, who is the minor league hitting coordinator. He said there could be changes organizationally down the road, but for 2025, Brown is going to focus on the major league hitting staff.
Yeah, got it. I mean, I think that makes sense. If I recall correctly, Jeff Albert did have some of that power, but I think when Albert left, there was definitely a reshuffling of the major league and minor league responsibilities. So it's good that the Cardinals at least think highly enough of some of their minor league hitting coordinators because we have seen a number of hitting prospects at least come through to the major league level and be highly touted and really tear through the minors, even if they haven't quite hit at the major league level the way we would want them to.
Mozeliak was also asked about the staff and whether there were going to be any more changes to the major league staff. There was reported several places that they would. He clarified that the same coaches who are there are going to be there. They're going to add what he called an embedded analyst. And this is basically a resource for the uniform staff, but they didn't expect any further changes with the uniform coaches beyond the announcements of obviously Brown and Jon Jay.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I saw that on Twitter as well, and I think it's interesting that he did note the embedded analyst because again, that does seem to portend a shift towards maybe a little bit more of a focus on the analytical side of the game than there has been in the past. And especially if they can have an embedded analyst who can maybe take some of this data and give it to coaches and let the coaching staff kind of filter through the rest of the system and the rest of the players. That's an area where they could potentially help the Cardinals. And I think it's a trend that we've seen baseball as a whole shifting towards. So it's good to see the Cardinals getting on board.
And we'll have to see how that evolves. I mean, there have been game planning coaches and different names, Packy Elkins and some guys like that around the team. So, it's not clear whether this is an incremental position or maybe just filling a position that had an opening. But more to come. A couple of the other things that Mozeliak was asked about that were interesting was, where is he on the payroll? And, understanding, before back when they had the postseason press conference, the Cardinals, they basically said, hey, they need to understand they have to get a better picture of the revenue plan for next year. They still don't have that. He says he thinks he has a general understanding of where things are, but there are still some revenue flow uncertainty. So he wasn't ready to commit as to what kind of payroll. Related to that, he also said that he was going to have conversations with the most expensive players on the team. He didn't say it this way, but the most expensive players on the teams who have no trade protection. Of course, guys like Arenado and Sonny Gray and Wilson Contreras. He said he's partway through those conversations, but he hasn't completed them yet. So there's no news yet on, how grand the roster changes to the Cardinals might be in this offseason. What would you like to see him do if you had your druthers?
So I like the approach that he's taking, at least with let's not just trade all of our best players and all of our most expensive players. Let's see if they want to be a part of this for the longer haul or not. I do think I'm obviously not wishing for a Nolan Arenado trade. I love watching him play for the Cardinals. If he wants to keep playing, I have no issues with the Cardinals letting him keep playing. But I think one of the things that we've seen is Nolan Gorman really struggling at second base consistently. And I think an Arenado trade would free up third base for Gorman to go back to his natural position and potentially put himself into the Cardinals' long-term plan. So not necessarily saying that is better long-term for the Cardinals, but I could see a world in which you then really solidify your infield, both in terms of your long-term infield, but then you also really solidify your infield defense by also adding another power bat into the lineup consistently at a position he's comfortable playing. So I think there's potential improvement there. And I do think it'll be interesting to see what the Cardinals do with Wilson Contreras because obviously, as we've talked about many times, Jimmy Crooks and Leonardo Bernal are coming up. They already have Ivan Herrera and Pedro Pages in the majors. That is a position where they have overwhelming talent throughout the organization. So I think if they want to keep Contreras, it would make sense to see if he's okay with a role that includes DHing and maybe some first base here and there, as opposed to just being a full-time catcher, because I think long term for the organization, that's probably the best route to take right now.
And they need his bat at least until these young guys come up. And you mentioned, of course, Jordan Walker and Nolan Gorman. They've been disappointments, but most recently, but they've been better in the past. And so, maybe another benefit, it certainly can't hurt the change from Turner Ward to Brant Brown might be to, find out what it takes to unlock the offense from these guys.
Yeah, exactly. It might be. And like I certainly have not given up on guys like Jordan Walker and Nolan Gorman. As you said, we've seen what they can do. They have the potential to be really good, even cornerstone players for this team. It's just really, can they put themselves into that picture now, especially as Gorman starts heading towards arbitration? And can we really give him an opening? Because I think it's hard to put him at second base again next year with Brendan Donovan already on the roster. So he's
And
likely,
Thomas JC right around the corner.
yeah. So he likely needs to have third base freed up, or maybe the Cardinals want to try to put him at first base if Goldschmidt doesn't come back, or like there are options out there, but just the status quo is not super friendly for somebody like Nolan Gorman. So I would not be shocked to see the Cardinals shake it up to really try to get playing time for some of these young guys.
Last question about the Cardinals and the roster. This is something I wrote about at the Cardinal Nation, free article. Folks can come and read about it. There's a lot of people upset right now because Tommy Edman was so successful for the Dodgers in the championship series. And I kind of looked at it a different way. It's saying, hey, the Edmonton is, going to be entering his last year before he's eligible for free agency. He's making $9.5 million in 2025. If the Cardinals hadn't traded him at the deadline, they would be trying to trade him now, or they'd be thinking about trading him now. And, Edman wasn't going to be the difference maker that kept the Cardinals from making the playoffs or not. For me, it seemed more disappointment about Eric Fetty, what they got for him. And my take is, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, I wish the Cardinals would have come to realization at the end of July that they weren't going to go anywhere in 2024. And instead of trading Tommy Edman for a major league pitcher, trade him for the prospects. They want to get younger. They want to get better. They should have started that then rather than waiting till now, 2 months later.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a case to be made for that. But I think what the Cardinals didn't necessarily hurt them. Obviously, if they could have gotten some prospects for like Kyle Gibson or Lance Lynn or whoever you want that was on an expiring deal, maybe that was worth it. But when I look at the Tommy Edman Eric Fetty swap, like the Cardinals wanted to go for it. They wanted starting pitching. Eric Fetty or Tommy Edman wasn't going to be able to help them for like another month. I understand why they did it. And now when we look at it, Eric Fetty is going to be a controllable starter, making $7.5 million this year. Probably looking at like roughly a 2.5 WAR pitcher, or maybe higher if he pitches more like he did with the White Sox. And that's going to be a valuable commodity at the deadline as well, if he can pitch and stay healthy like that too. So we know the Cardinals are not going to be in the same spot at the deadline this year or next year as they probably were this year. So I think the Cardinals are still fine with, they traded Edman for Fetty, tried to go for it, it didn't work out. Now this year they can take Fetty, hope he pitches well, and then try to trade him for prospects at the deadline. And more or less, you waited a year to get those prospects, but you're still getting them eventually.
Last question, Blake. Ryan Helsley's in a similar contract situation with Edman, heading into his last year. We don't know what he's going to make, but I think MLB trade rumors said he was going to make just under $7 million, probably via the arbitration process. But he's obviously played a tremendous role in sealing wins for the Cardinals. Based on their change in direction for 2025, do you keep Ryan Helsley or do you trade him?
I would shop him. And I'm not necessarily on the trade Ryan Helsley train, but I would be willing to float his name out there and see what other teams are willing to give up. If you find the right deal and a team is willing to give up like a steep price for Ryan Helsley, then absolutely that's a trade you should do. If teams are more so just kind of waiting it out, seeing how things go next year, and they don't really want to commit to overpaying for Helsley, then you hold on to him, take him into the season. And if Ryan Helsley keeps pitching like he did last year, he'll be somebody that teams will be after at the deadline, and you can kind of reevaluate at that point if you want to lock him up long term or try to trade him for potentially a bigger haul because teams get more desperate at the deadline, knowing that's the final chance they have to make moves.
I tend to agree with you on that. I think it's not a have to do, but they're in a good position to listen to offers and decide what they want to do. I'm always curious, and of course we don't know the answer, but this is the last year of John Mozeliak's time as the PBO of the Cardinals, and I don't think he's going to gut the team and have a 100 loss team. So he's going to do some surgical moves around the edges to try to set them better up for the future. But let's face it, they're looking at trying to figure out how to be competitive and still get fans to come to the ballpark.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they've talked about it for years, how ticket sales impact the money that goes into the team. So nobody wants to watch an 100 loss team, as you mentioned. I think the Cardinals have too many good young players to be in a 100 loss team, even if they did tear down a lot of their major pieces. But I tend to agree with you. I don't think this is going to really be a total tear down of any player that has trade value. I do think this is going to be a little more measured, a little more conservative.
Well, we'll watch it during this off season. Actually, the off season hasn't even officially begun yet for baseball in a whole. So there'll be a plenty more to talk about, and we'll be back next time to talk more about prospects. I'll be heading down to Arizona to do my annual view of the fall league. So we'll have plenty of news and commentary here in future episodes of Wednesday with Walton and Newberry here at the Cardinal Nation. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks, Blake.